The deal had 3 minutes left. Nobody in that room knew it except the one person nobody looked at, in the hushed, velvet-lit privacy of the Polaris suite, where negotiations unfolded behind doors thick enough to swallow a scream. Death had already taken its seat at the table. It arrived quietly, as it always does, tucked beneath the mahogany like a secret between old friends. The room smelled of aged wood and ambition, of the particular cologne that men wear when they believe they are the most dangerous thing in the room. Crystal glasses caught the light. Pens hovered over documents worth more than most people's lifetimes. And no one, not a single one of them, looked down. Jemima Perry moved between the chairs the way air moves between walls. She had spent 2 years perfecting this particular disappearing act. White shirt, pressed to severity. Black vest, name badge angled just so. Tray balanced, posture controlled, expression set to the precise warmth required to be pleasant without being remembered. She was a ghost in uniform, and she had learned to be grateful for it. The ghost did not get questioned. The ghost did not get found. But the ghost noticed everything. Her hands placed the breadbasket down without a tremor, which was a kind of miracle, because her chest was doing something violent and unscheduled. She had catalogued it the moment she crossed the threshold. The room's energy was wrong, not in the obvious way, not in the way of raised voices or tightened jaws. Wrong in the way only a forensic mind could measure. The way a balance sheet looks immaculate on the surface, and rotten at the root. At the head of the table sat Jung Woo-sung. She had known his name before tonight, the kind of name that preceded a man into a room like weather. In person, he was more contained than she expected, still in the way that deep water is still. His face gave nothing, not irritation, not calculation, not hunger, and that absence of expression was its own kind of power. His hands rested flat against the table beside a leather folio, and she noticed, as she moved behind him to adjust a glass, that his knuckles were white. Just slightly, just enough for someone who had spent a decade reading what numbers refused to say. He was the only one in the room who was actually paying attention. She had been a ghost for 2 years. Since the morning she walked into the offices of Hargrove and Bryn and found her name scrubbed from every system, her credentials revoked, her case files vanished into the elegant machinery of corporate plausible deniability. Since the night her father sat across from her at his kitchen table, not angry, she could have survived angry but quiet. That particular quiet of a man watching his child be erased and knowing his hands were too clean to stop it. Integrity, he had said, is the only thing they cannot manufacture evidence against. She had believed that once. Then she had stopped believing it. Then she had put on this vest and learned to be invisible. But the ghost of his voice was here now, circling low in the air-conditioned silence of the suite, and it was asking her something she did not want to answer. She refilled the water glasses. She aligned a fork. She listened. The discussion moved between languages, English to Korean, Korean back to English through the mouth of the translator seated at Woo-sung's right. Smooth voice, expensive watch, the practiced fluency of a man who had made himself indispensable. And Jemima, whose 2 years of invisibility had been spent reading, studying, rerouting the forensic intensity she no longer had a career to aim at. Jemima understood every word in both directions, which meant she also understood what was being changed. Not dramatically. Never dramatically. The best lies never are. It was a softening here, a slight repositioning there, a term adjusted just enough to shift liability across the table without either side noticing. It was elegant. She would have called it elegant, in another life. But that was not what stopped her breathing. What stopped her breathing was when she moved to retrieve a fallen napkin, and her eyes dropped below the table. And the room, for one airless moment, ceased to exist entirely. The device was small, deliberate. The kind of thing placed by someone who understood that timing is everything, that the most effective destruction is the kind no one sees coming. The digital face counted down in red, indifferent to the crystal glasses above it, indifferent to the deal being signed, indifferent to the man whose hands were white-knuckled against the table, because some part of him already knew the room was wrong. He just didn't know how wrong. Jemima straightened. She placed the napkin on the linen. She walked back toward the dessert station and picked up a plate with steady hands. This is not your world anymore. She had said it to herself so many times over 26 months that it had stopped feeling like a reminder and started feeling like a scar, something that had healed over badly, tight and permanent, pulled whenever she moved in a direction she wasn't supposed to move in. She said it again now, standing at the dessert station with a plate in her steady hands and a truth in her chest that was anything but steady. There was a bomb under that table. She had seen it in the half-second her eyes dropped below the mahogany, that cold, deliberate face counting down in red. indifferent to the crystal above it, indifferent to the documents being signed, indifferent to every man in that room who believed that the most dangerous thing present was himself. It was small, precise, placed by someone who understood that the most effective destruction never announces itself. And it was counting. She didn't know from what number. She didn't know to what end. What she knew was the arithmetic of the situation, and the arithmetic was simple and brutal minutes, not hours, the kind of math that didn't care about context. Her hands did not shake. She was almost angry at them for that. She set the plate down on the station and pressed her fingertips lightly against the cool metal edge of the tray, grounding herself in the sensation the way her father had once taught her to ground herself in facts when emotion tried to take the wheel. What do you know for certain, Jemima? Start there. Only there. She knew there was a device. She knew it was active. She knew that 7 men were seated above it, negotiating the terms of a deal that would never conclude, not at the rate that counter was moving. She knew that she was the only person in this room who had seen it, because she was the only person in this room that no one had thought to watch. Being invisible had finally become useful. She lifted her eyes back to the table without moving her body. Jung Woo-sung sat exactly as he had when she first entered that particular stillness that she had catalogued within 30 seconds of crossing the threshold, before she had catalogued anything else. It wasn't the stillness of a man who was calm. She understood that now with a clarity she hadn't had 20 minutes ago. It was the stillness of a man whose instincts were already firing, who already felt that something in the room's architecture was wrong, but who had not yet located the source. His hands were flat on the table. The knuckles were pale. His eyes moved in a pattern too deliberate to be casual across the Americans. Back to Julian, down to the documents, back to the Americans like a man running a calculation he didn't have all the variables for. He was looking for the wrong thing in the right place. She thought about walking out. She catalogued that option with the same forensic honesty she applied to everything, laid it flat, examined it, refused to dress it in anything more comfortable than what it was. Walking out meant 7 men died in a sealed room. It meant the blast investigators would find her name badge in the wreckage. It meant she had stood close enough to the truth to feel its heat and had chosen the cold instead. She had done that once before. She had sat across a mahogany table not unlike that one and watched her name be erased from every system in the building and said nothing, because saying something required a belief that the truth still had weight, and she had not been sure it did. She was sure now, terribly, inconveniently sure. The ghost of her father moved through the air-conditioned silence like something that refused to be archived. Integrity, he had told her, is the only thing they cannot manufacture evidence against. She had believed that before the world taught her otherwise. She had stopped believing it when the lesson arrived. And somewhere in the space between the dessert station and that mahogany table, between the woman she had buried and the woman still breathing inside the burial, she found that she believed it again. Not because the world had earned it, because she was tired of being the proof that it hadn't. She picked up the Chateau Margaux. She had chosen it deliberately, a reason to approach, a reason to lean close, a reason to put her mouth near enough to a man's ear that the words she was about to say would travel no further than she intended them to. Her steps were measured. Her face held its warmth. She was a ghost, and ghosts did not hurry. But her heart was already running. She reached the head of the table. She leaned toward his shoulder, her body angled just enough to block the sightline of the men across from him, the bottle raised as natural cover. She could feel the heat of the room differently here, the specific atmospheric weight of a man who took up more space than his body occupied. She steadied herself against it, and then, in Korean so clean and unaccented, it stopped him like a hand against a chest. She said it. There is a bomb beneath the table. Do not react. She placed the bottle down with a soft, deliberate click, and the room, without knowing it, changed forever. He did not react. That was the first thing she registered as she straightened and stepped back from the table. Not a flinch. Not a flicker. Jung Woo-sung absorbed the information she had just delivered. There is a bomb beneath the table. Do not react, and responded by becoming more still than he had already been, which she would not have thought possible 60 seconds ago. His eyes stopped their deliberate pattern and fixed on a point just beyond the table's edge, with the terrifying precision of a man who had just located the variable he had been missing and was already 3 moves into what came next. She returned to the dessert station, set the tray down without a sound. Her pulse was architecture stacking beats on top of each other in a rhythm that had no business being this controlled. She had worked in high-pressure environments. She had delivered findings that ended careers, that unraveled years of careful deception, that made powerful people look at her with a specific hatred reserved for people who are correct. She knew what it felt like to hold information that changed the weight of a room. She had never done it with this particular weight attached. From the dessert station, her sight line to the table was clean. Wu Sung reached for his water glass with his right hand unhurried, natural, and in doing so caught the eye of the man stationed near the east wall. The contact lasted less than a second, but she saw the man's posture shift in response. A silent instruction received and acknowledged between people who had operated together long enough to share a vocabulary that required no words. She watched Julian. That was the pressure building beneath everything else, not just the device, but the translation of it. The softening of terms, the repositioning of liability, the subordinate clause that had shifted financial exposure entirely onto Wu Sung's side in one elegant, invisible sentence. She had heard it clearly enough to know it was not a linguistic accident. It was authored, commissioned by someone who had studied the contract's pressure points in advance, and had placed Julian in that room like a pen placed in a specific hand to sign something that would never say what it appeared to say. Julian was not the architect. Julian was the instrument, and every instrument had someone who had tuned it. His baritone moved through the room with its practiced ease, bridging languages with the fluency of a man who had made himself indispensable and trusted that indispensability to protect him. The Americans nodded along. They had no idea that the man across from them had just been told there was a countdown beneath their feet, and had responded by becoming more dangerous than he had been 60 seconds ago. She found herself thinking against every reasonable instruction she was giving herself that she had never seen composure like it. Not power. She had seen power perform itself in boardrooms for a decade. Men who needed volume and posture and the weight of a title to make a room feel them. What Wu Sung had was different. It was the composure of someone who had made peace with chaos so completely that chaos could no longer use surprise as a weapon against him. It was the specific stillness of a person who had decided at some point exactly who they were and had stopped negotiating with the world about it. She looked away. She straightened a napkin that did not need straightening and told herself, firmly and without much conviction, that this was not the moment for that kind of noticing. But the noticing had already happened. It sat in her chest alongside the adrenaline and the fear and the forensic fury of a mind running at full capacity, quiet, inconvenient, and entirely unwilling to be filed away. Wu Sung moved first. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have registered to the Americans across the table or to Julian, whose performance was still running on the assumption that the room belonged to him. It was a small thing, the kind of thing only someone already watching would catch. He uncapped his pen, turned to a fresh page in the leather folio, and wrote 4 characters in Korean, unhurried, as though taking a note on the proceedings. Then he angled the folio, just slightly, toward the east wall. The man stationed there absorbed it in a single glance. He was already moving toward the door before the folio closed. His exit timed to the natural rhythm of the room, a man stepping out to take a call. Nothing more. Nobody looked. Nobody counted. That was the architecture of a well-trained team, the ability to move without creating the shape of movement. Jemima watched it all from the dessert station, and understood that she had handed a lit match to a man who already knew exactly which fire to start with it. Julian's voice continued its smooth transit between languages. He was in the middle of a clause about indemnification. She caught the Korean version first, precise and non-negotiable as Wu Sung had delivered it, and then heard it arrive in English as something softer, something with give in it, something the Americans could pull at later in a courtroom and find yielded in their direction. It was meticulous work, the kind that required not just fluency, but foresight, an understanding of how legal language behaves under pressure, which specific words carry weight and which ones dissolve when tested. Julian had not stumbled into this role. He had been built for it, or had built himself for it, which was somehow worse. She thought about her own fluency. The years she had spent acquiring Korean not for any professional requirement, but because her mind had always moved toward complexity the way water moved toward depth naturally, without needing a reason. She had studied it the way she studied everything she loved, which was to say completely, which was to say until she understood not just the language but the architecture of thought it housed. The way certain emotions in Korean had no precise English equivalent. The way formality and intimacy existed on a spectrum that English flattened into a binary. She had never imagined using it like this. Wu Sung spoke. His voice was measured, directed at the Americans, carrying the surface texture of a man continuing negotiations in good faith. But the register had shifted, something in the cadence had tightened by a fraction. The way a room tightens when someone opens a window and the pressure changes before the air does. Julian began his translation, and Wu Sung looked up. Not at the Americans, not at Julian, at her. It was brief, the length of a breath, the duration of a heartbeat, and it carried nothing she could easily name. Not gratitude, not assessment, something in between, or something that existed in the space those words didn't cover. It was the look of a man who had recalibrated an entire situation and was now locating every variable with fresh eyes. And she was one of the variables, and he was not finished with her yet. She held it. She did not look away. That surprised her. In 26 months, she had perfected the art of the dropped gaze, the small, practiced deference of someone who had learned that being overlooked was a form of protection. She had not looked a man like him in the eye since the morning her career ended, because looking directly at power was how you reminded power that you existed, and existing had become dangerous. She held it anyway, for exactly as long as he held it. Then he looked back at the Americans and said something in Korean that Julian translated as a request for a brief recess. The Americans agreed easily. The confidence of men who believed a recess meant the other side was softening. They pushed back their chairs with the unhurried ease of people who did not know what was beneath them. Jemima felt her chest constrict as they stood, the irrational terror of proximity, of men moving around a table that held something counting down in red. But Woo-sung's security had already shifted into a formation so natural it looked like coincidence bodies redirecting foot traffic, creating pathways away from the table's underside, guiding without appearing to guide. Within 4 minutes, the room had emptied of everyone except Woo-sung, 2 of his men, and the distant, professional hum of a building that did not yet know what it had almost lost. The device was located, neutralized, removed with the quiet efficiency of people who had contingencies for contingencies. And then there was silence. Woo-sung stood at the head of the empty table, his hands resting on the back of his chair, looking at the space where the documents had been. He did not look relieved. He did not look shaken. He looked like a man taking precise inventory of a situation he intended to fully understand before he took his next step. He turned. Jemima was still at the dessert station. She had not moved. She was not sure her legs had received the instruction to move. She was standing in the wreckage of the last 20 minutes with a clarity so acute it was almost painful. The particular lucidity that arrives after adrenaline finishes its work and leaves everything raw and overbright. His voice, when it came, was quiet, unhurried, in English, which told her something that he was choosing not to reveal yet what he knew about what she had revealed. "Stay," he said. It was not a request, but it was not unkind, and she stayed. The suite felt different, empty, larger, somehow. The amber lighting that had made the room feel intimate during the meeting now fell across the remnants of the evening, with the particular exposure of a stage after the audience has left half-empty glasses, an uncapped pen beside a leather folio, the chair Julian had occupied, still slightly angled from the table, as though he had only stepped away for a moment and expected to return to it. He would not be returning to it. Woo-sung stood at the window with his back partially to her, hands clasped behind him. He had instructed his 2 remaining men in Korean before they left low, precise, without repetition. Pull everything on Julian. Financial records, communications, travel history for the past 18 months, not just what he did, who built him to do it, how far back the construction went, and who else inside the organization had been part of the architecture. He spoke the way she used to write reports. Conclusions first, evidence second, no wasted language. When the men were gone, he stayed at the window for a moment that she did not interrupt. She understood by now that his silences were not empty. They were purposeful, the thinking of a man who had decided that speaking before a thought was complete was a form of imprecision he refused to practice. "You understood the translation," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, both directions." "Yes." He turned. Not fully a partial turn that brought her into his sightline without making the moment confrontational. He studied her without urgency, with the quality of attention that does not rush toward conclusions because it is more interested in accuracy than speed. "You have been working here for how long?" 26 months. The recalibration was subtle, the adjustment of a man updating a calculation with a variable he had not previously weighted correctly. And before that, she walked through the opening he made. Senior forensic accountant, Hargrove and Bryn, International Division. I specialized in cross-border financial irregularities, specifically the kind designed to look like compliance while functioning as concealment. She held his gaze. "I was good at it." "I know," he said. "You knew," she said carefully. "Before tonight. I know the names of everyone in a room before I enter it, including the staff." He said it without apology, without gentleness, simply as fact. "What I did not know was that you spoke Korean, or that you would use it the way you did." A pause. "I underestimated you. I want you to know I am aware of that." The acknowledgement arrived without performance. No qualification, no deflection. Just the clean, direct accountability of a man who considered accuracy a form of respect. She had not received that particular combination power and honesty, held in the same pair of hands in a very long time. "Julian," she said, moving them forward. He wasn't working alone. The translation errors were too systematic. They required legal knowledge, not just linguistic fluency. Someone gave him the contract's pressure points in advance, told him exactly which clauses to soften, which to preserve, and precisely how to move liability without triggering your attention. She held his gaze. That person understood your organization well enough to know which voice you trusted most in that room. Julian was chosen because someone knew you would not question him. Something shifted in Wu Sung's expression. Not surprise, he was past surprise. Something colder and more deliberate than that. The specific focus of a man identifying the location of a wound. "There is someone I want you to see," he said. He crossed to the door and opened it. One of his men brought Julian into the room with the quiet, irresistible efficiency of someone who had been waiting precisely for this instruction. Julian entered with the surface composure of a man who had prepared for this moment, the careful arrangement of an innocent face, the measured breath, the hands relaxed at his sides. He was good. She could see exactly how good he was, and it made her jaw tighten. Wu Sung did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He laid it out in English, every mistranslation, in sequence, with the specific clause number and the precise divergence between what had been said and what had been rendered. He did it the way she would have done it methodically, without heat, with the devastating calm of someone who has already won and is simply ensuring the record is complete. Julian's composure lasted through the second clause. By the fourth, something behind his eyes had gone very quiet in the way of a performance that has run out of audience. Jemima watched him. She had promised herself she would not speak during this, that she would observe, catalogue, and let Wu Sung conduct what was his to conduct. But when Julian's eyes moved to hers with the specific calculation of a man locating the weakest point in a room, something in her straightened. "Don't," she said quietly. Just that. One word. Julian looked at her for a moment, reading her the way she imagined he read everything. For the angle, for the opening, and found none. She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had spent 26 months being underestimated and had recently decided she was finished making that easy for people. He looked away first. Wu Sung's two men moved to flank Julian, not roughly, not dramatically, simply finally, the silent geometry of a verdict that had already been rendered. Julian was escorted from the room without another word, and the door closed behind him with the soft, pressurized click of something ending. The Americans had already been escorted out through a separate exit, informed, in the polished language of corporate necessity, that the evening's negotiations had concluded. They had left confused, recalculating, stripped of the confidence they had carried in with them. The deal was dead. The device that was meant to ensure it could never be renegotiated was gone, and the man they had underestimated was still standing at the head of an empty room, methodically accounting for everything that had tried to move against him tonight. He turned back to her. In the amber light of the emptied suite, with the remnants of the evening arranged around them like evidence, he looked at her with that precise, unhurried attention, and she felt, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that she was not simply being seen. She was being understood, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of a person looking at you, and finding not a version of you but the actual you, without the distance or the interference of what they expected to find. "Sit down, Jemima," he said, quietly. "I think it is time you told me who you actually are." She pulled up a chair, and for the first time in 26 months, she did not make herself small before she began. She did not sit the way she had been sitting for 26 months. There was a difference, and she felt it the moment she settled into the chair, the way her spine straightened without effort, the way her hands found the table's edge with the ease of someone returning to a posture their body had never fully forgotten. For 2 years, she had sat in staff briefings with her shoulders curved inward, her presence minimized, her intelligence carefully tucked behind the pleasant blankness of someone who was only there to take notes. It had become second nature. The smallness of it. She did not sit small now. "The liability clause," she began, "was the first point of manipulation. In Korean, you stated it as absolute no ambiguity, no room for reinterpretation under any jurisdiction. Julian translated it as preferred terms, which in an American legal context creates an entirely different burden of proof if the contract is ever challenged. That was not a linguistic error. That was a surgical insertion." She paused, watching him. "But it was the indemnification clause that told me everything. The way he restructured it shifted the financial exposure from the American side entirely onto yours. Not partially, entirely. And he did it in one sentence, using a subordinate clause that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't reading the Korean and English versions simultaneously. Woo Sung had not moved. His eyes had not left her face. Someone gave him the contract language in advance. She continued. Not the final version, the structural blueprint. The specific pressure points, which clauses to preserve, which to compromise, and precisely how to compromise them without triggering your attention. She held his gaze. That person is not Julian. Julian is the instrument. I want to know who played him. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and texture, the particular quality of a silence between two people who are both thinking at speed and have mutually agreed, without saying so, to let the thinking finish before the speaking begins. Omnicorp, Woo Sung said. The word arrived in the room and did something to the air. Jemima went very still. It was not the stillness of someone who didn't recognize the name. It was the opposite, the involuntary arrest of a body that has just heard something it was not prepared to hear in this context, in this room, from this man. Omnicorp was a name she had carried for 26 months like a stone in the chest, a name that appeared nowhere in any official record of what had happened to her career because it had been too carefully removed from those records. But that lived in the forensic reconstruction she had done in her own time, on her own, in the apartment she could barely afford, with the files she had managed to preserve before her access was revoked. You know that name, he said. Not a question. They destroyed my career, she said. The simplicity of it surprised her how clean it sounded when said plainly, without the weight of everything it had actually cost. I was 18 months into an audit that would have exposed a network of offshore accounts being used to launder revenue through a series of shell companies. The audit pointed directly at a subsidiary of Omnicorp. 3 weeks before I was due to deliver my findings, I was accused of leaking client data. My credentials were revoked. My files were archived under a security protocol that required executive clearance to access. By the time anyone with that clearance looked at them, the trail had been sanitized. She paused. I was not fired for what I did. I was fired for what I was about to find. Woo Sung was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something she hadn't heard in it before, not softness exactly, but a deliberate absence of the distance he had maintained since the room emptied. The parent company of the two Americans at this table tonight is Omnicorp's North American Investment Division. The stone in her chest shifted. They did not come here to negotiate, he continued. They came here to acquire, and if the acquisition failed, to ensure that what I know about their Pacific operations died in this room with me. His eyes held hers with an unwavering steadiness that she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of honesty, direct, undecorated, offered without performance. You saved my life tonight, Jemima. I do not say that to create a debt between us. I say it because it is precise, and I prefer precision. She absorbed that. The way he said her name not for the first time tonight, but differently now, as though he had decided it belonged in his mouth with more care than it had required before. They framed me, she said, and tonight they tried to kill you. That is not a coincidence. No, he agreed. It is a pattern. He leaned forward slightly, just enough that the distance between them, already charged with the evening's accumulated weight, became something she was actively conscious of. Which means you are not just a witness to what happened in this room tonight. You are evidence. And evidence, his voice dropped a register, quiet and deliberate, requires protection. She should have felt the clinical logic of that and nothing else. She felt considerably more than the clinical logic of that. I don't need protection, she said. I need what you have access to, the financial architecture of their Pacific network. The accounts, the intermediaries, the shell structures. I know what I was looking for 18 months in. I just never got to finish looking. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, never dramatically with him, but she was learning to read the smaller movements, the way his jaw released a tension she hadn't noticed it holding, the way his eyes held something that in another man, in another room, she might have called the beginning of admiration. Then finish, he said, and the word landed between them like a door opening. She went back to work the next morning. That was the part nobody would have predicted, not her manager, who handed her the breakfast service rotation without looking up from his clipboard. Not her colleagues who moved around the staff room with the particular tunnel vision of people who had long since stopped wondering about each other's inner lives, and certainly not the version of herself that had stood in the Polaris suite 6 hours earlier and told one of the most powerful men she had ever encountered that she wanted to finish what she had started. She put on the vest. She pinned the name badge. She balanced the tray. She was still a ghost. But the ghost knew something now that it hadn't known yesterday, that its invisibility was not a sentence. It was, if handled correctly, a strategy. The breakfast shift moved with its usual mechanical rhythm. Tables turned, orders landed, coffee was refilled before it was requested, because anticipation was the baseline requirement of this work, and she had always been better at it than the job deserved. She moved through the dining room with the same practiced fluency she had spent 26 months perfecting, and nobody looked at her. And for once that fact felt less like erasure, and more like cover. She was thinking about Julian. Specifically, she was thinking about the 18 months of positioning that must have preceded last night, the careful construction of a man inside Woo-sung's organization, trusted enough to be placed at a table that mattered, fluent enough to operate in the gap between languages where oversight goes to die. That kind of insertion required patience. It required resources, and it required someone inside Woo-sung's circle who had validated Julian's presence. Someone whose endorsement had made the questions stop before they started. Julian was not the architect. Julian was the door, and every door had a frame. She was running the calculation in the back of her mind, the part of her brain that had never learned to be fully off-duty, when her manager found her at the service station and told her, with mild confusion, that there was a car outside for her. Black. Private plates. The driver had asked for her by name. Not by her name badge name, her full name. She finished the table she was clearing, set the tray down with precision, and walked out through the service entrance into the gray morning air. The car was exactly as described, a sleek, unremarkable black sedan that managed to communicate considerable resources through its very determination to be unnoticed. The driver handed her a thick manila envelope without a word and waited. She opened it, standing on the pavement in her server's vest. The first page stopped her breath. It was a transaction record offshore, routed through 3 shell companies she recognized from her original audit, terminating in an account she had never been able to locate, because it had been created 11 days before her access was revoked. The account that had received the payment that had been used to bribe the 2 technicians who had fabricated the data breach evidence against her. She knew this because the second page was a signed statement from one of those technicians, notarized, time-stamped, and detailed with the particular specificity of someone who had been given a very good reason to stop staying silent. Her hands were steady. She was distantly amazed by that. She turned to the 3rd page, then the 4th. Then she stopped counting pages, and simply read, standing on a London pavement in a server's vest, with the morning cold against her face and 26 months of carefully maintained composure doing something complicated and structural in her chest. He had not just pulled a thread, he had exhumed the entire architecture. Fabricated emails, traced to their origin server, offshore money trails, mapped to their endpoints. The name of the Omnicorp executive who had authorized the operation against her, a name she had suspected, had circled in her own private reconstruction of events, but had never been able to prove. Marcus Thorne, chief of Omnicorp's Covert Compliance Division, the same man who had signed off on Julian's placement 18 months ago, the same man who had been in the room last night, not at the table, never at the table. Men like Thorne never sat at the table, but in the infrastructure of it, in the translation, in the device beneath the mahogany, in the entire carefully engineered attempt to end Woo-sung's Pacific operations and silence the one audit that had ever come close to finding the accounts that funded all of it. She had not been collateral damage. She had been a target. Specifically, deliberately. A target because 18 months into her audit she had gotten close enough to the truth that removing her had been cheaper than hoping she wouldn't find it. The manila envelope held the proof of all of it. She stood with it in her hands and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 26 months. Not relief exactly, and not triumph, but something older and more fundamental than either. The specific sensation of a floor returning beneath your feet after a very long time of not being sure there was one. Her phone vibrated. A message. No name attached, but she recognized the precision of the language immediately. Short, undecorated, exact. When you are ready. Not before. She looked at the message for a long moment. Then she looked down at the envelope. Then she looked up at the gray morning sky above the city, which was doing nothing remarkable, which was simply being the sky, indifferent and vast and present. She typed back 2 words. Tomorrow. 8. Then she walked back inside, picked up her tray, and finished her shift. She wore the suit. It had been living at the back of her wardrobe for 26 months in a dry cleaning bag she had never opened. Charcoal gray, Italian cut, the kind of garment that had been purchased for a version of her life that she had subsequently been informed no longer existed. She had moved it from her old apartment to this one without unpacking it. The way people carry certain things not because they believe they will use them again, but because throwing them away requires a certainty about the future that grief does not permit. She unzipped the bag at 6:45 in the morning and stood looking at it for a moment that was longer than she intended. Then she put it on. It still fit. That felt significant in a way she didn't examine too closely. The idea that the body, which had spent 26 months in a server's vest, had not fundamentally changed shape from the body that had walked into boardrooms and delivered findings that made powerful people uncomfortable. The mirror returned her image with a directness she had been avoiding. She looked at it properly for the first time. In a long time, the sharp line of her shoulders in the charcoal fabric, the particular way she held her chin when she was not performing smallness, the expression of a woman who had remembered something important about herself and was still in the process of deciding what to do with the remembering. She picked up the envelope. She left the apartment at 7:15. The building that housed Woo Sung's London operations was exactly the kind of structure that communicated power by refusing to announce it glass and steel, unmarked at street level, the lobby sparse and immaculate in the way of places that have never needed to perform accessibility, because accessibility was never the point. The woman at the reception desk looked at Jemima with the polite, assessing gaze of someone trained to distinguish between people who belonged and people who believed they did. Jemima held her gaze and gave her name without elaboration. She was taken to the 14th floor without further question. The office was not what she expected, which meant she had been expecting the wrong things, the theatrical trappings of a certain kind of power, the oversized desk, and the diplomas, and the particular furniture of a man who needed his environment to do the work of intimidating people before he arrived. There was none of that. The room was spare and precise, with the quality of a space organized by someone who had decided long ago that their attention was the room's most valuable asset, and had arranged everything accordingly. One long desk, a narrow console holding a single lamp, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city's morning geometry. Woo Sung stood at the window with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him in that posture she was beginning to recognize as his version of stillness, not absence, but focus turned inward. He was already dressed, already composed, already several moves into whatever the day required of him. She wondered briefly if he had slept. She wondered, then, why she was wondering. He turned when he heard her enter. His eyes moved across her once not intrusively, not with the particular male inventory she had learned to deflect over years of professional life, but with the attention of someone updating a mental record, taking in the suit, the envelope, the way she was standing. "You look like yourself," he said. It was a simple observation. He delivered it simply, and yet it arrived with a precision that the simplicity didn't fully conceal the specific accuracy of a man who had been paying enough attention to know what herself looked like, and who had noticed the distance between that and what she had been presenting to the world. She set the envelope on the desk between them. "Marcus Thorne," she said. "He is the connective tissue between everything: my audit, Julian's placement, last night's device, the financial network I was 18 months into dismantling before he had me removed. He operates through Omnicorp's Covert Compliance Division, which functions as a corporate intelligence unit legal in its structure, entirely illegal in its application. He has been running interference for the Pacific accounts for at least 4 years, possibly longer." She opened the envelope and laid the documents out with the systematic clarity of someone who had spent the night organizing them into an argument. "What you gave me filled the gaps I was missing. What I had fills the gaps your team hasn't located yet. Together it is a complete picture." Woo Sung looked at the documents. Then he looked at her. "You did this last night," he said. "After your shift. I did it instead of sleeping." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the first she had seen from him, and it arrived so briefly she might have doubted it, except that she had been paying attention with the same forensic intensity she applied to everything that mattered. She found that it mattered. "There is something you need to know," he said, and his tone shifted not dramatically, but enough. The slight lowering of register that she had learned, in the short violent span of knowing him, indicated that he was moving from professional to precise, in a different way. Personal precise. Omnicorp has been attempting to acquire controlling interest in 3 of my Pacific subsidiaries for 14 months. I declined each approach. What happened last night was not the first attempt to pressure me into reconsideration. It was the most direct. He paused. "What I did not know, until I read your file this morning, was that the audit you were conducting 18 months ago, the one they shut down, was examining the same accounts they have been using to fund the acquisition pressure." She absorbed that. "They shut me down," she said slowly, "to protect the same money they were planning to use against you." "Yes, which means my investigation and your situation are not parallel, They are the same investigation. Yes, he said again. The word settled between them with the weight of something that had just become irrevocable. She looked at the documents spread across his desk, her evidence and his, laid out together, the two halves of a picture that neither of them had been able to complete alone, and felt the specific vertigo of a moment that is quietly, irrevocably rewriting the trajectory of everything that follows it. She had come here this morning thinking she was delivering findings. She understood now, beginning a partnership. The thought arrived without the resistance she would have expected from herself, no instinct to qualify it, no impulse toward the careful professional distance she had maintained for 26 months as a form of self-preservation. Just the clean, unguarded recognition of something true. She looked up from the documents and found him already looking at her. "Then we finish it together," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that was one beat longer than professional necessity required. "Together," he said, and neither of them looked away. 3 weeks was not a long time. It was not long enough to dismantle a 4-year financial network, not long enough to build an airtight legal case against a man who had spent those 4 years ensuring that every trail leading to him passed through at least 2 layers of corporate insulation before it arrived at his name. It was not long enough to fully trust someone, or to fully understand them, or to know with any reasonable certainty whether what you felt in their presence was the product of genuine connection, or the specific emotional intensity that danger manufactures between people who survive something together. Jemima knew all of this. She also knew that 3 weeks was precisely long enough for certain things for a working rhythm to develop between two people who thought at similar speeds, for the particular ease of shared language to become something she looked forward to rather than simply relied on, for the way he took his coffee, and the way he read a document, and the way he went very still when he was about to say something that mattered, to become information she carried without having chosen to collect it. The 14th floor had become her floor. Not officially, she had no title yet, no contract, nothing that existed on paper. What she had was a desk positioned at an angle to his, close enough for efficient communication, and far enough to maintain the professional geometry they had both been observing with the careful, mutual discipline of people who were aware of a current between them, and had wordlessly agreed not to name it until the work was finished. She had her files. He had his network. Together they had built, over 21 days of long mornings and longer evenings, a case that was no longer circumstantial. It was surgical. Marcus Thorne had been meticulous. She gave him that. The offshore architecture was elegant, 7 shell companies across 4 jurisdictions, each with its own legitimate surface function, each connected to the next, through a series of transactions so routine in appearance that they had survived 4 years of standard compliance review without a flag. He had understood that the best concealment is not invisibility but boredom. Make the numbers dull enough and no one looks twice. She had looked twice. She had looked until the boredom cracked, and what was underneath it came apart in her hands like wet paper. On the 22nd day, she laid the completed case across Wu Sung's desk. He read it the way he read everything, without hurry, without performance, with the total absorption of a man who had decided the document in front of him deserved his full attention and was giving it without reservation. She sat across from him and did not pretend to work on something else. She watched him read, because she had earned the right to watch, and because watching him was something she had stopped apologizing to herself for 3 days ago. He set the last page down. "This is enough," he said. "It is more than enough," she said. "It is irrefutable." He looked at her across the desk, that direct, unhurried attention that she had first catalogued in the Polaris suite as a predator's stillness, and had since come to understand as something considerably more nuanced. It was not the attention of a man assessing threat. It was the attention of a man who had decided that a person was worth the full weight of his focus, and was giving it without the performance of giving it. She had not received attention like that in a very long time. She was not certain she had ever received it from someone whose opinion of her had already been tested by something real. "I want to talk about what comes next," he said. "The filing," she said. "We take it to the Financial Crimes Unit simultaneously in 3 jurisdictions, London, Seoul, and the Cayman Islands. Simultaneous because if one jurisdiction moves first, Thorne has the network to suppress it, before the others are triggered. Simultaneous removes that window entirely." "I meant after the filing," he said. She held his gaze. "I know what you meant," she said. The room was very quiet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved through its morning with complete indifference to what was happening on the 14th floor. The traffic, and the weather, and the 10,000 ordinary transactions of a day that did not know it was significant. He stood, moved around the desk with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything, no performance, no announcement, Simply the decision made and then executed with the quiet certainty of a man who had stopped second-guessing himself at some point in his life and never picked the habit back up. He stopped at the edge of the desk, close enough that the careful professional distance they had been maintaining for 22 days became something she was acutely, physically aware of having maintained. He looked at her. She looked at him, the current that had been running beneath 3 weeks of shared work and careful language and long evenings in a room that smelled of coffee and documents, and something neither of them had named. It was not hidden anymore. It had not been hidden for some time. They had simply, mutually, been waiting for the work to be finished before they allowed themselves to stand in the truth of it. "You are not a ghost," he said, quietly, with the precision he reserved for things he meant completely. "You have not been one since the moment you walked toward that table with a bottle of wine and the specific courage of someone who has decided that the right thing is worth the cost of doing it." He paused. "I need you to know that I see that. Not what you were trained to do, or what you discovered, or what you built in 3 weeks on my 14th floor. I see you, Jemima." She stood, not because the moment required it, because she was done sitting at a careful distance from something true. "I know," she said. "I see you too." He reached out and tucked a loose curl gently behind her ear. The smallest possible gesture, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of touch that asks before it arrives and means everything precisely because of its restraint. Her breath caught, not from surprise, from the specific recognition of a moment you have been moving toward without letting yourself know it, arriving exactly when it was supposed to. She did not step back. He did not rush forward. They simply stood in it, the accumulated weight of 23 days and one violent night and 2 people who had found each other in the wreckage of things that were supposed to destroy them, and let it be exactly what it was: real, chosen, unhurried. The city moved outside the window. The document sat finished on the desk. And for the first time in 26 months, Jemima Perry was not a ghost in someone else's story. She was the author of her own. The briefing ran for another 40 minutes. When it concluded, the room emptied with the purposeful efficiency of people who had left with more to do than they had arrived with, which was exactly the intended outcome. Sujin was the last to leave. At the door, she paused, turned back, and looked at Jemima with the precise, evaluating gaze of a woman who did not distribute her respect casually and knew it. "The dual language audit protocol," she said. "The jurisdictional simultaneity. That is not a framework someone builds from theory." A pause. "That is a framework someone builds from loss." She left before Jemima could respond. Jemima stood alone at the head of the table and let the silence settle around her. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, Seoul moved through its late afternoon with the unhurried vitality of a city that had been taken apart and rebuilt so many times that resilience was no longer a quality it practiced, it was simply what it was made of. The Han River caught the light to the south. The old palace sat in its permanent quiet to the north, and between them the city breathed, indifferent and alive, carrying its history in its bones without being buried by it. She understood that more than she once had. She heard the door. She knew his walk by now, the particular rhythm of it, unhurried and even, the footfall of a man who had decided long ago that urgency was a performance he didn't need to give. She had learned him in layers over 6 months, the way he read a document, the way he held his coffee going cold because he had forgotten it existed, the way he went very still in meetings when someone said something that interested him, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, and the way he looked at her when he knew she was. She had catalogued all of it with the same forensic precision she applied to everything that mattered. He came to stand beside her at the window. Close. The kind of close that had long since stopped requiring explanation between them, that had moved, somewhere in the accumulated days of shared work and long evenings, and the particular intimacy of rebuilding something together, from deliberate to simply true. His shoulder was warm against hers. His eyes were on the city. "Sujin is going to be difficult," he said. "Sujin is going to be excellent," Jemima said. Difficult and excellent are the same thing at the beginning. She felt, rather than saw, the smile. She had become fluent in those, the small movements of a face that had spent years giving very little away, and was learning, in the privacy of moments like this one, that giving something away to the right person was not exposure. It was a choice, a deliberate, specific, irreversible choice. "The board approved the Seoul expansion," he said. "I know. Sujin told me before the meeting." He turned his head to look at her. "You knew before you presented." "I always know before I present," she said. "That is not arrogance. That is preparation." He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the 14th floor 6 months ago, with the full, unhurried weight of attention that did not perform itself. She had stopped finding it unsteadying somewhere around the 3rd week. She had started finding it the thing she oriented toward, the way a room orients toward its light source, without making a conscious decision to do so. "There is something I have been meaning to say," he said. She waited. With him, she had learned to wait not passively, not with the old deference she had once mistaken for patience, but with the active stillness of someone who understood that what he said when he had finished thinking was always worth the space before it. "When you walked into the Polaris suite that night," he said, "I had already decided the room was wrong. I had run the calculation 6 different ways, and kept arriving at the same conclusion that something in the architecture of the evening had been compromised, and that I did not yet have enough information to locate it." He paused, and then a woman I had not looked at carefully enough leaned toward my shoulder with a bottle of wine and told me in perfect Korean exactly what I needed to know. Another pause, longer this time. "I have thought about that moment more than I have told you." She turned to face him. "What have you thought about it?" she asked, not to redirect him, because she wanted the actual answer. He met her eyes with the directness that was simply the way he was built, no artifice, no management of impression, just the unguarded honesty of a man who had decided she was worth his truth. "That I was looking for the thread in the room," he said, "and what I found instead was you." The city moved outside the glass. The river caught the last of the afternoon light and held it for a moment amber and gold, the specific warmth of a day deciding to end beautifully rather than simply ending. She felt it on her face through the window. Felt his eyes on her face with the same warmth, the same quality of light that asks nothing and offers everything. She reached up and touched his jaw slowly, with the deliberateness she had learned from him, the gesture of someone who had earned this moment through every difficult thing that had preceded it and was not going to rush it now that it had arrived. He turned into her touch. His hand came up to cover hers, not to hold it in place, simply to meet it, the way 2 people meet when they have stopped pretending they are not moving toward each other. "I spent 2 years being invisible," she said quietly. "I thought it was the only way to stay safe. I thought if no one looked at me, nothing could reach me." She held his gaze. "I was wrong. The only thing invisibility protected me from was this, from being found by something real." He brought her hand from his jaw and held it between both of his carefully, the way you hold something you have decided matters. His thumb moved across her knuckles in the same slow, deliberate way it had on the 14th floor 6 months ago, except that now there were no documents on the desk between them, no careful professional distance to observe, no reason to let the moment pass unreceived. "You were never invisible to me," he said, "not from the moment you walked in." She leaned forward and kissed him, not urgently, not with the compressed desperation of something that had been held back too long, with the specific, unhurried certainty of 2 people who had taken the long way to arrive somewhere and found, upon arriving, that the long way had been exactly right, that every delay and every careful distance and every moment of deliberate restraint had been a form of building, and that what they had built was solid in the way that only things made slowly and honestly ever are. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he gave everything that mattered to him completely, without reservation, without the performance of it. Outside, Seoul held its breath for no one. But inside the 31st floor, in the last of the afternoon light, Jemima Perry stood in the life she had rebuilt from the truth, and let herself be known by the one person who had seen her clearly from the beginning. She was not a ghost. She was not a victim. She was not the debt of what had been taken or the sum of what had been done to her in the dark. She was the woman who had spotted what no one else looked for, who had spoken when silence was the price of safety, who had walked toward a dangerous table with steady hands and rewritten the entire geometry of her life in the length of a whispered sentence. She was a fortress, and she had not built it alone. If Jemima's journey from ghost to fortress moved something in you, subscribe and stay close. The next story is already waiting, and it begins exactly where you least expect it.